everyone, Muslims and non-Muslims alike, regardless of nationality, gender or ethnicity. We aspire to have the courage to address the issues that matter most towards Muslims and non-Muslims alike, and we invite all people, irrespective of faith or creed, to join us. Over the past decade, this has become more difficult given the war on terror and the use of various policies including PREVENT and the newly enacted Counter-Terrorism and Security Act of 2015, which have had a chilling effect on honest and legitimate discourse. With all of that said, I'm just going to introduce our chair for this evening, Nadia Chan, who is currently an LLM student and whose research interest lies primarily in terrorism and criminal law. She's involved in a number of grassroots campaigns which focus on Muslim prisoners. Thank you.
Just I'll go here for everyone to turn up, got a good turnout. Today's event is entitled Brothers Behind Bars, the Plight of the Muslim Prisoner in the Context of the War on Terror. Under the guise of the War on Terror, the UK has adopted a series of policies and laws to prioritise what they call national security measures over basic principles of justice and fairness. The impact of counter-terrorism policies and practices have resulted in alienation and criminalisation of the Muslim community. Prejudice and ill-informed and even fabricated accounts of terrorist acts produced through forced or coerced confessions have been the basis to justify a whole raft of anti-terrorism legislation and illegal and immoral actions in the UK. The most obvious victims of this state repression are the wrongly imprisoned Muslim prisoners. The plight continues to be largely ignored within academic, media and government institutions. Thank you for joining us. Our first speaker today is Moazzam Begg, ex-Guantanamo detainee and Director of Outreach and Cage Representative. Thanks.
Most merciful. Good evening to everyone. Assalamu alaikum. I have to admit, for this evening I haven't prepared a thing at all. So I don't really know what I'm going to talk about. Other than the fact that I guess I don't need to prepare anymore, because speaking about the plight of the prisoners isn't just an abstract or an academic exercise for me. It's something I've lived for several years, since 2001. And talking about my own experience is something I've done so many times, I'm bored of hearing my own voice. So it's important to just get into some context, why and how we're here. And I can't help but to remember every time I see my lawyer, Gareth Pierce, is that when I came back from Guantanamo in 2005, she didn't have time enough to speak to me because she had to rush off for an impending decision about the detention without charge or trial, not in Guantanamo, but here in the United Kingdom, of 16 Middle Eastern and North African men who'd been detained without charge or trial. The ruling in their case was that it had been unconstitutional, i.e. illegal, for the government to have held them in such a state. And so whilst Guantanamo was taking place and people were being tortured and abused and the world was rightly trying to, at least to be seen to be condemning it, nobody spoke about this, about what was taking place right here in Britain. Nobody mentioned the Guantanamoization of British prisons and the British legal system, the English legal system, whereby law after law was being passed over us. And as we've seen over the past 14 years, almost one new piece of anti-terror legislation or more has been passed that de facto, almost only applies to the Muslim community. And the most recent of which, of course, is the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act in January of this year, which was passed, which places a statutory duty upon teachers, upon lecturers, on doctors and nurses and others to defile that sacred relationship between teacher and student, between doctor and patient, which essentially says that these privileged relationships are now subject to what the government will determine will be the idea of extremism. So these people in the public sector are now, after 14 years, 15 years of the war on terror, told to define and identify and scrutinize what may or may not be a Muslim turning to extremism. For of a surety, the primary factor in all of this is that you must be a Muslim. Just as in Guantanamo, the primary factor must be that you are a Muslim, not that you're a terrorism suspect. Because there are no Tamil Tigers there are no real IRA there are no Shining Path guerrillas there. You must be a Muslim, primarily, first and foremost, to be a prisoner in Guantanamo. And so, you've seen this week the return, or a couple of days ago, of Shakir Ahmed. The most disgusting case you could probably ever come across. Outrageous in its facts. That a man could be held for 14 years, without charge or trial, subjected to torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, not just at the hands of the United States government, but with full complicity and the full involvement and endorsement of our own government, which simultaneously talks about the rule of law. The rule of law, get this into your heads. A government that talks about the rule of law, that is complicit in the detention without charge or trial of its own citizens and residents. How hypocritical could you possibly be? How much more hypocritical could you be than that? But that's at the far end of the war on terror. It's still hard to envisage, hard to imagine what Guantanamo really means. For the few of us who were held there, even for us it's hard to describe. But then when you look here in the United Kingdom, when I was imprisoned in 2014, I understood that people in the government don't like me, or people like me because we call for accountability. We keep showing them up every single time they've been involved in one abuse or the other of human rights. We turn up, pointing the finger, showing the evidence, which place, which time, which date was our government involved in the abuse of its own citizens. But then I saw, for example, two young Muslim men from Birmingham who had gone to Syria in 2013 at a time when our own government was supplying non-lethal aid to the Free Syrian Army, which fought alongside every rebel group, including Al-Qaeda in Syria, and shared resources and battlefronts. These two young men had gone over at that time when our government and its foreign minister was talking about bombing the Assad regime. The messages and the signals they were sending to these young men was that it's not a crime to support the fight against it. Things have changed, of course, vastly since the despicable so-called Islamic State has risen. But at the time, that's the message that was coming across. So these two young men went over. They stayed with one of the rebel groups. They fought, they didn't like what they saw, especially with the rise of ISIS. So they decided to return back to Britain. Their mother had been encouraged by the police to go and report the case to the police, and they said to her that we will assist you. They didn't know, she didn't know, that in fact she was reporting a crime to the police. And that as a result of that reporting, the two young men, 18 and 19-year-old kids, were going to be arrested as a result. But not only were they arrested, they were prosecuted. And they were convicted. And they were given 12 years and 8 months in prison because of the fact that they came back voluntarily, because they didn't want to be part of ISIS. Yes, they may have done or said some silly things, as teenagers often do. But did it mean, as when the police arrested them, that there was no threat, as the police said, there was no threat to the safety or security of the British public? That with these men, regardless of that statement by the police, they're still going to be given 13 years without the opportunity to actually explain what this was all about? Is that the situation that we're in? Every time almost that you see, and you can check this up if you don't believe me, that there's been an arrest over the past couple of years, the police are quick to say that there was no threat to the safety or security of the British public. Now, if that is the case, what's happening? Why are these laws being pushed one after the other? We already have more laws and measures than most of the European countries in order to be able to tackle extremism and terrorism and so forth. Yet, we have seen law after law being passed applied to the Muslim population of this country and being targeted and vilified. And simultaneously, just so you get some measures, some ideas of what I'm talking about, in the same year, a young ex-British soldier, 19 years old, from Manchester, was found with 2 improvised explosive devices. He said he had extra pieces of shrapnel, 187 pieces in each, for maximum effect and damage. They found that he had beheading videos of the Ku Klux Klan and the Russian white supremacist organizations. He had no surrender EDL flags, and he had an array of weapons in his house. But when the judge gave the judgment on him, he never used the word terrorist to describe it. In fact, he said this man is not a terrorist. And he was given 2 years under a 19th century Explosives Act. And that's the comparison, where you can clearly see somebody poses a major threat to the safety and security of the British public. And on the other side, the police say there is no threat. How is this possible? How has terrorism and extremism and everything that comes with it allowed us to become so lopsided in our view of how we're looking at our communities? I say it's disgusting. I say we've been hoodwinked. I say we've been had. And because the various media organizations and tabloid press and beyond keep pushing this mantra of how dangerous and scary and frightening Muslims are, and ignorance is bliss, so the majority of the population who will never be affected by these laws will say, well, I've got nothing to hide, I haven't done anything wrong, why should I worry? Well, that's right. Treat your minorities this way. It was Mandela who said, you can judge a nation by how they treat their minorities and how they treat their prisoners. And he would know, of course, because after all, call us as much as we want terrorists, the most respected man on the planet, don't you ever forget, the most respected man on the planet was a convicted terrorist. What are you going to do about that? I'll tell you what, we're going to build a statue of him right outside Parliament to commemorate him. That's what we're going to do. At latest 2008, Mandela was on a no-flight list to America. It was ridiculous. But nonetheless, this is the type of rhetoric we've been taught to buy, that the Muslims are a problem, that we need more laws and we need more measures and we need unprecedented legislation, the likes of which we didn't even put through at the height of the IRA campaign. And let's not forget, we've had people within Parliament say that the Muslim threat is the greatest one ever to face this country. And again, silly people will buy it. Have they forgotten the Troubles? Have they forgotten that after the execution of people protesting against internment, i.e. detention without trial, in the city of Derry, people rose up? Have they forgotten that 3,000 people died in that conflict? 3,000. Have they forgotten the measures that they instituted and criminalized the community as a result and said the Irish community are the ones who are terrorists? Because we haven't forgotten, and if we have, we're to blame. Because there is precedent for this type of behavior and this type of demonization. And we have to remind them constantly that in the end, these laws, these measures, this behavior, this demonization, this alienation, this vilification of an entire community can only do one thing: push people into a corner. You want to make people adhere to a sort of amorphous set of British ideas and values that you can't even adhere to yourself. How can you talk about the rule of law when you have consistently detained people without charge or trial? When you've consistently removed the presumption of innocence? When you've consistently been involved in or complicit in the torture of your own citizens and others? When you have invaded countries based on false, tortured testimony? When you have drone striked and killed your own people without any legal process? How can you dare to talk about the rule of law and the non-adherence to this British value that doesn't exist? How can you celebrate 800 years since the signing of the Magna Carta and claim that we hold on to this idea as a civilizational factor to the rest of the world that we exported, that is part of their constitutions to this day? How can you say, to no man will justice be denied or delayed, and you have a man called Shakir Ahmed whose wife and children are all British, 14 years, doesn't see a day of justice? And those same tabloids who complain consistently about the Muslim threat after a man has been tortured and abused, what do they say? He should have been executed. He's lucky. He should thank Britain for bringing him back. He should thank the Americans. He could have been in Saudi. He could have been in another country. He could have been in one of those despotic Muslim countries. And they're like, as I said before, like the rapist, where the rapist wants to be excused. In fact, he wants to be praised because he stopped the rape. It's like the famous saying of Malcolm X: you take a knife, you don't take a knife and stick it in a man's back 9 inches deep, put it back 5 inches and say, we've made progress. That's precisely what they're asking us to do. To thank them. To thank them because of the end of the abuse. Normally what happens if somebody abuses you and tortures you in rightly minded societies, you give them an apology. The criminal, the perpetrator, is made to say, I'm sorry, I will not do that again. We've not seen anything like that at all. We've seen more and more language, belligerent language, and measures being passed by politicians and media. We've seen no accountability. With all of this, who's being held accountable? Torture is a crime. False imprisonment is a crime. Abuse of human rights is a crime. If anybody amongst this audience here was caught falsely imprisoning somebody just for a couple of hours, you'd be arrested. Just for a couple of hours, imagine 14 years. If you were to torture somebody, imagine what would happen to you. So how is it possible that the governments can get away with this? I'll tell you why, how it's possible. Because the victims are Muslims. The victims are Muslims. That's how they can get away with it. That's how they've done it. And up until we stand up and count ourselves and say we are equal citizens, they'll continue to do so. I'm going to end there, and thank you very much for listening.